Joining and attending in Andrea's final presentation. I'd just like to introduce and thank our external reviewers for this presentation. I'll start with Andrew King, is a graduate of Dalhousie University School of Architecture. Spent the better part of a decade after graduation living, working, and studying in Europe. In 2003, he was awarded the Canada Council for the Arts Rome Laureate for a project titled Romalux. Apologies. Since 2016, he has been with the Montreal-based practice of Lemay, as well as having a position of professor of practice at McGill University. Thank you very much for attending this, Andrew. Much appreciated. Our second external reviewer is Evan Weber, an award-winning filmmaker and architect. He was art director on The Handmaid's Tale, Season 1, receiving both Emmy and Directors Guild Awards. He also was assistant art director for Del Toro's The Shape of Water film here in Toronto, I think at Massey Hall and other locations out on Queen West. What a great film that was. Congrats on that. And he has juried on various film awards and public art competitions. So on behalf of Andreas and the Department of Architectural Science here at Ryerson, I want to thank you gentlemen very much for taking time out and being part of Andreas' final presentation. Andreas, I also wanted to mention, Professor Arthur Wrigglesworth is supervisor for Andreas, as well as Professor Vincent Hui as second reader. And I'm here as the department representative. So I hand the floor now, not the floor, but the monitor now to Andreas. Wish him the best of luck. It's 10 to 12, 20 minutes, Andreas, for your presentation. And then a 20-minute Q&A. Is that all right with you, Andreas? Are you prepared to take over at this point?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go on silence.
So first of all, I'd like to thank the guests for being here and my committee for the support. It's been over a year of work and devotion from behalf of them. I would like to thank my family. This wouldn't be possible without them. So I thought it would be best to record my presentation since we're already using a virtual platform. So I'm just gonna go ahead and play the video for you guys and get started with the presentation. This thesis is called Self-Regulated Architecture, and it will attempt to face two main assumptions of humanist subjectivity that influence the architectural discourse. The first one is human exceptionalism. In other words, the building is a representation of the body. The second one, presuppositions that modernism causes. The divisions between human and non-human, the subject and the object. In other words, the divisions between the human and the architectural object. This presentation consists of three parts. The first one is called the subversion of the subjects, and it will examine hybrid, subverted, and estranged subjects and their relationships to architectural discourse. The second, speculative objects, describes three imaginary objects and their systems of operation behind them. The last part is the dissolution of the object, which attempts to subvert the humanist object in a speculative project of a house. Part 1. Subverted subjects. So the realm in which architecture exists is coalescent with the history of human thought. Throughout centuries, human thought has evolved according to our understanding of the physical world. This understanding can be described in terms of epistemes. An episteme is defined as a period dictated by a system of knowledge. Such a system of knowledge is based on the collection of assumptions and presuppositions that govern all scientific discourse. They determine the unconscious decisions of the members of society. According to Michel Foucault, there are three epistemes: the preclassical, the classical, and the modern. The preclassical is based on resemblance and representation between things. For example, the idea of heaven represented on earth. An example of this is the plan of the Christian basilica, which adopted the shape of the cross to resemble the divinity of Christ. On the other hand, the classical episteme is characterized by the birth of man, or humanism, and the separation of objects and subjects. Human consciousness and the things of the world. During this episteme, rationalism takes place as central theory for architectural discourse. An example of this is represented by Le Corbusier's modular, which implements a 6-foot-tall man as a source of proportion for architectural design. The last episteme is the modern episteme, which is the central theme for this thesis. The modern episteme is characterized by the dissolution of the subject or the death of man, in which the distinctions of objects and subjects are subverted. Man exceptionalism is no longer valid. Humans are a source of vitality, a creative force among other sources, but not one that is exceptional in terms of transcendence, escape, or representation. The project presented is Cap Street by Diller and Scofidio, 1993. It consists of a house in which the objects do not serve the subjects. They do not dictate. They reveal instead. The chairs no longer provide comfort, but they are cut in order to threaten the body. These objects now act beyond their standard domains. The chairs are attached on tables, bisected, and connected in ways they should not. They become independent of domestic life. One must ask for permission, as human agency is no longer a given. But these objects only permit it. Deleuze and Guattari give a good description of this train of thought in 1,000 Plateaus, when they say, "We treat the body with the organs as the full egg before the extension of the organism, and the organization of the organs, before the formation of the strata. It is constructed piece by piece, and places, conditions, and techniques are irreducible to one another. The question rather is, whenever the pieces can fit together, and at what price? Inevitably, there will be monstrous crossbreeds." So in the modern episteme, there is not an essence of the human. Where the human used to be in the classical episteme as a concept is now marked by an ongoing process, forces, histories, judgments, desires, and technologies. All these things converge with us as hybrids and help us shape our history. Just like Diller and Scofidio's Cap Street, we continuously carve ourselves out of the world. The building is no longer an extension of the human body. Instead, it becomes estranged, distanced, and alienated from human subjectivity. It is no longer in service of the subject, but it interacts and forms our subjectivity. The 1922 skyscraper project by Mies van der Rohe is able to disengage from human presuppositions through the dissolution of the object. Mies uses two strategies to achieve this goal. The first one, he removes the solidity of the building cladding and replaces it with glass. As a result, glass accentuates the reflections and refractions according to the light conditions and points of view of the spectator. This phenomenon causes the building to absorb, mirror, distort, and change the city. The second technique that Mies uses is the interruption of the building's order. He does this by breaking away from units of measurement, such as the grid, in order to conceive abstraction. Thus, Mies eliminates the centrality of the human subjectivity, by defamiliarizing the subjective understanding of the architectural object. Part 2. Speculative objects. In an attempt to displace the traditional presuppositions of the humanist subject, this work attempts to produce the defamiliarization of the object through the following 3 design research projects. The first one is Estrangement of Objects, which consists of a contextless object of complex form that attempts to create estrangement through the cognitive absorption of perception. Okay, so the second one, the tension of objects, relates to the augmentation of the perceptual qualities of the object through the juxtaposition of form and surface characteristics. The third one is the intensification of objects. This project seeks to detach the object from traditional geometric and rational interpretations. Project 1. Estranged objects. In order to investigate the techniques utilized by both Mies and Diller and Scafidio, the design exploration will attempt to modify aspects of scale through the contextualization and decontextualization of the object. It will also remove the formal order of the object by eliminating any perceivable regular geometries or units of measurement. Lastly, the materiality utilized is meant to provoke conflict as it is made of reflective and translucent materials. So the physical form of the object was modified using computerized parametric techniques, which allowed multiple transformations that included bending and twisting of the original massing. The distortion of the object resulted in a kind of abstraction that blurred the formal understanding of the object. The object produced had complex shape that is difficult to discern in plain view. The aesthetic outcome causes allure and curiosity and triggers desire to approach the building in order to understand it. Recontextualizing the object further intensifies the aesthetic perception of the object. It creates conflict with the city. It disturbs the city and the objects within it. Such a clash of objects makes the viewer doubt the veracity of the image. It is possible to associate the object with the idea of estrangement in a sensual manner, as it can modify the user's dependence on the object on a psychological level. These changes attempt to produce a sense of shock in the viewer, or allure. Thus, the object is interpreted as an agent capable of defamiliarization by producing tension and intensification of the aesthetic engagement between the object and the viewer. Similar to an individual approaching an unrecognizable territory, the object inhibits the viewer from perceiving its true essence. It becomes an object condition that is hiding its true meaning. Tension of objects. This project displays a series of experiments on objects and the way they are articulated. The purpose of this project is to create tension between the object's form and its surface qualities. The idea is to conceptually create a separation between the form of the object and the articulation of the surface, through a series of transformations that use color and texture in order to disturb the aesthetic properties of the objects. Here, for example, we have a solid that has been modified into a fabric-like material. Porous and transparent. This causes the boundary edge to be lost. This loss of boundary is augmented by the introduction of movement. 3 more objects have been put into the test. The object on the upper left part of the screen is composed by a fabric-like material with plastic characteristics that include smoothness and shyness. Because of the porosity of the material, the boundary edge has also been blurred. The one on the upper right corner was created through fragmentation of the overall mass. The fragments that make up the object resemble rocks or soil that seem to crumble. In this case, the object produces an indiscernible boundary, while the materiality creates a lack of visual inertia. The object on the bottom shows defragmentation of a superimposed grid of cubes. Above, some of these cubes have been replaced by spheres. There is a juxtaposition of materiality as the solidity of the concrete cubes contrasts the translucency of the glass spheres. The composition is meant to create tension between the rigidity of the grid versus the plasticity of the spheres. In this case, the spheres blur the boundary that otherwise would be clearly defined if they were absent. Finally, the object is inserted within the new context. The new image gives the object a new self-image and a new reality in which the surroundings partially absorb it. The defamiliarization occurs at this pivotal moment because of the tense acceptance of the object in such an environment. Intensification of objects. A collection of 10 figures was created as part of this iterative project, aimed to develop an architecture that cannot be easily classified or reduced to a specific type or style. By using 3D printing manufacturing, it was possible to obtain exact shapes. These shapes vary in complexity, depending on the design approach implemented. The 3D printing models have been coated with luminescent paint as well as other paint coatings, then placed under the effects of ultraviolet light to understand the effect of light on the form and material. The results are contrasted with the objects under normal lighting conditions. The perception of this object is intensified by the luminescence qualities of the paint that create different material characteristics due to the effect of ultraviolet light. Thus, the paint coating as a medium can communicate alluring qualities when exposed under the atypical unusual frequencies of light. This phenomenon contradicts the normalcy of the object, and it creates an artistic experience. Some of these objects were more successful than others in abstaining from visual reductionism. For example, Pyramids 1 kept the synthetic characteristics. On the other hand, the figure Uncanny object was able to adhere to the project's expectations. It reveals topological complexity and resolution levels that are uncommon in the composition of architectural representations. So the previous design research projects were based on an experimental design approach. As a result, I concluded that in order to achieve the estrangement of objects, it is necessary to modify the perceptual characteristics of the object to cause conflict and prolong their perception. The well-established conventions such as the scale, order, form, context, and materiality need to be dissociated to instigate an aesthetic experience. That means that the material characteristics of the object must be intensified in order to create tension, allure, and confrontation. As a result, this causes the object's materiality to be associated with foreign objects, therefore creating hybrids that displace the centrality of the humanist subject. Part 3. Design Project, Unholy House. The starting point of this project recognizes the perceptual irrationality that occurs when the architectural object is subjected to a high degree of complexity of form and materiality. The purpose of this is to reduce the logical understanding of the building as a whole and to create the defamiliarization of it that occurs as a result. For this project, the building was contemplated within the parameters of a traditional house, such as the property limits and the setbacks. However, the construction and inhabitation of this building are a process that do not adhere to the conventional. There are two main stages in which the house is contemplated. The first one is incubation, and the second one is inhabitation. The incubation process is the only step in which the architect and the user have full agency over the object. This step is characterized by the selection of the site and the location of the house within the property. Once selected, the house's structural components are constructed in position, the foundation and the skeleton. Once these components have been already put in place, the house cladding will grow around the structure. The cladding of the building is made of strands of active material, programmed to wrap around the structure and create an enclosure. This step may take 5 to 30 days, depending on the initial size of the house. Once the house has fully grown as intended, the house is ready for the initial inhabitation. Inhabitation is a process in which the user must negotiate their presence with the house. The user will first inhabit what it seems to be a large oval. This is the moment when the negotiation between the user and the house begins. During the process of inhabitation, the user must discover himself or herself within the building as the house allows inhabitation. At first, both user and the house cannot comprehend one another. The user may not find comfort in a space that is mostly vacant and functionless. On the other hand, the house cannot accommodate the user's needs. It doesn't know them. Cohabitation always needs time to develop between two or more organisms. Luckily, the house is never static. It continues to grow and mutate depending on the user and the site. For example, if the user spends most of this time in a specific part of the building, it will activate and enlarge such area. Similarly, the house will reduce accommodation in underused spaces. Suppose there are additional users moving into the building and they require additional rooms. In that case, the users must initiate inhabitation for the house to expand and develop such spaces accordingly. It is a matter of time and learning from one another. Any vegetation, sunlight, and topographical characteristics of the site will also affect the house and the way it behaves. Accessibility needs and privacy are determinant for inhabitation, but this must be negotiated as well. One must remember that it is a constant process of giving and taking in which the house has also a say. The conditions are not predetermined, but the user must give up some agency and recognize the building as an external agent. Therefore, the building is never fully comprehended, and it is not entirely under control of the inhabitants. As the building, site, and human begin to develop a relationship, they will find intimacy and comfort. The user will become accustomed to the dwelling. The house will also become accustomed to the user's needs and provide for them. This will become a mutually beneficial relationship between two organisms, a mutual symbiotic relationship in which both organisms interact and co-inhabit by choice. If there are any changes in the type of inhabitation, the house will continuously mutate and accommodate for it. However, the existing circumstances will dictate any future possibilities of growth. In other words, any growth that occurs once inhabitation has begun will be the starting point of any future possibilities of inhabitation. Growth does not revert, but it is modified. The house is an organism. The human is an organism. The house is continuously strange to the human, but now it is recognized through the process of inhabitation. This design research project, the Unholy Home, is not neutral. It reveals. The house creates detachment of the humanist subject in three different ways. The first one through the uncanny aesthetics, which discard the logical understanding of the object. The second one is through the formal arrangement of its elements, which requires negotiation between the user and the house. Lastly, through the informal functionality, which causes disengagement. The house is to be discovered. The status of the house is not a given. The house constantly changes and transforms. Therefore, inhabitation is never user-oriented. To conclude, buildings can already feel, see, move, and even breathe. This has resulted in a new type of uncanny experience. An uncanny experience that cannot merely be understood by the defamiliarization of the architectural object. Instead, this new type of uncanny does not occur because we are immersed, but because we cannot remove ourselves from our technological networks. These technologies are an invasion of privacy. They measure, they track, record, analyze, and predict us. They also stimulate us emotionally and intellectually. They use this feedback to establish themselves as self-regulated organisms designed to decipher and control any outcomes. Therefore, human-object interactions produce uncanny feelings, not because they are unfamiliar to us, but because they erase the distinctions between objects and subjects, human and non-human, material and immaterial, experience and simulation.
Okay, thank you very much, Andres. Your timing is perfect. I will quickly go on mute again, but now we have approximately 20 minutes for a Q&A. So I open up the floor to anyone. Please feel free.
I'll start the ball rolling. So, Andres, man, good presentation. I do appreciate the kind of concision that you had with the. I know that you had a lot of material. Having gone through the book and having been at your previous presentations, you're able to concisely put the stuff together in a very clear way. I do think that this is one of the more successful video presentations for Thesis that I've seen this past couple of weeks. So and without going to all the kudos, I do have one question for definition. And would you be able to elaborate on the difference between, specifically within the context of your final project, the difference between mutate versus growth?
Sure, yeah. So growth is something that happens, I would say unpredictable. It's something that just occurs, right? As a result of mutation. So mutation essentially would be changes that happen because of interaction between the building or the human and something else. Could be a site or another organism. So essentially mutation happens with interaction, when interaction between two organisms occurs. Growth happens as a result of mutation. They go together.
Okay, so you can't, so by that, so if mutation is incumbent on interaction, you said that growth can't happen without mutation.
That's right. Although I think in the case of the house, mutation could also mean movement, right? Of the skeleton of the house, not necessarily growth.
Okay, because I was going to say that in your building, you really presented it in a really strong way where there was like a sense of give and take, right? Yeah. And to use the term that you use in your book, the kind of human machine assemblage that you've got there is pretty notable. But I would say that responsiveness isn't necessarily a mutation. Like when you say that if you need an extra room, if you need whatever, it's for the user and the building essentially to kind of find itself, right? But I thought that was more akin to the growth definition. But your definition would classify that as a mutation. So I thought that was a very strange way to frame the way your architecture evolved here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I see the two things related. However, I think mutation has more than basically not, like I would say that growth could occur as part of mutation, but mutation doesn't necessarily occur as part of growth, kind of thing.
Okay. So I don't want to hog the mic time because I've seen some of your work before, and I want to really hear the comments from, Andrew and Evan, because they clearly know, hey, yep, there he's back. He's back. I like your car, by the way, Evan. Just I'll throw it to the guests because they've probably got better insights as someone who hasn't been sitting through with you for the last year or so.
This is Andrew. I just have a couple of points of clarification, or just how, Andrew, it's just your definition of a couple of things. How do you define materiality for this thesis? It's a word you use a lot, but at the end of the day, I think it's got a specific definition for the work that you've undertaken. Sorry.
Right. I mean, we have two types of materiality. I mean, one is the physical materiality. The other is the materials of the building themselves. By physical materiality, I mean whatever that is perceivable that can be touched or seen as a result of light refraction.
But to be for that, so when you're talking about, there's no definition of what it is, obviously, but it's both visual and haptic in your case.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. But other than that, there's no definition. It's about reflectivity. It's about tension between the other material. It's about its relationship with each other. It's not about specific porosity or things like that. I have two other definitions, and maybe this is a little bit too prosaic, but I'd like to know what you mean by artistic experience. You sort of touch on that about halfway through and then you used the word aesthetic experience. I'm wondering if you think those are in your understanding those are the same thing, or those are slightly different?
In the context of my thesis or the presentation itself, I'm using them as the same thing, as they are both related to one another.
Okay, thanks. Those are just the clarifications I was hoping for. I have a, then I'm going to jump in, or Evan, yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, we seem to have lost Evan temporarily. Hopefully he'll get back on. It seems he's having some trouble with the connection. Are there any other questions for clarification before Andrew starts in on the kind of response to the work? Arthur, you're okay?
Yeah, I'm just flipping through my notes, and there was this moment in page 4 of my notes, but I'm forgetting what the imagery was right now. But there, you talked about topological complexity, and you may have used the word representation, but I'm not sure that you did. It was something I wrote down. I think it had to do with the complexity of the geometry being something that resists a kind of a perceptual, like that you understand its totality from what you see. Sorry, you used some quite specific and I think powerful terminology for that. Hopefully, but can you talk a little bit about this thing of the representation? So that I think it's you kind of slipped by it, and I'm not sure if it was something that you intended to. Oh, that was it. You were resisting visual reductionism. So there's this topological complexity. But then I think you used the term representation, and I would like you to parse that out a little bit, maybe to the degree that you did for Andrew, those other terms.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of the project that I was mentioning, I think it was the second project which I manipulated a bunch of geometry, right? And I played with the scale and the complexity of the order of the parts of the object. So I twisted, I used new materials, and I contrasted the surface qualities of the geometries and the form itself, right? So there was a contrast there, and the idea is to create that topological complexity, right? In order to create the abstraction of the surface of the object.
Right. Yeah. That part I'm very solid on, but I guess I was just wanting to grab into more this representation in. I think in the terms of which you've been talking, or no, in more say typical terms, representation might be the expression, what we receive, and you as an author of telling us what showing us what you want us to see. Versus, I think in the context of your work and the designed object, you might start potentially reframing representation to some degree in that it's instead of what the author wants to show, it's what the object wants to show the subject. Do you see what I'm and we haven't really, I don't think we've really talked down that path before, but I think it's something that's quite interesting, that's just sort of blipped out in the way you made a bit of your script that you might it might be of some interest to you, right? This idea of who's the author of what we're seeing in this kind of venue, right? So the house on that street in South Etobicoke, if I'm walking down the street or I'm coming up to it, etc., I'm engaging with it, and it's an object in the environment, versus you're showing us the things of this house that you're deciding, right? You're showing us aerial views and interior perspectives, which is, in the kind of a more traditional approach would be you representing to us not just these are the facts, but this is what I want these facts to mean. And so,
Yeah,
I think that,
yeah. Sorry, guys.
in a way, I would say that representation is really closely related to the materiality or the physical materiality of the object as it's been manipulated by the artist, and it's and the experience itself is directly connected to representation. The experience itself, however, is a lot. I would say it's entirely subjective to the individual, and it departs from representation, the representation of the object. So I don't know if that clarifies a little what I'm trying to say by it.
Well, you know, I'm wondering, I think that what you're getting at, Arthur, is this idea about whose will is at work, you know, when you're interacting in this kind of symbiotic relationship, because we have the capacity as human beings to be perverse or subversive, or, you know, quite literally, we can just screw things up good, you know, at our own will. Well, can the computer do that, you know, or can the AI, the artificial intelligence, does it also have artificial subversion? Does it already have artificial perversion? Can it exert itself on us rather than learn from us, you know? Or we're learning from it? Yeah, I mean, the rhetoric is not the right word, but the conceit of it is that it's learning from us all the time. But does it work the other way around? Do we truly learn from it?
And
or vice versa, rather?
That's one of the things I'm trying to get to, because we, I mean, we're usually human-centric. We believe that that it is learning from us, but what are we learning from it? That's kind of like the question that is up in the air, right?
Can I jump in at this point? Sorry, I actually made this question, and my last page is really about. I had a whole bunch of stuff around uncanny and utility and all that kind of stuff, but this notion of what this building is doing as it responds to you, I have to say it's all about, it seemed to me it's about scale and utility, or at least about adding rooms if you need the rooms, or adding more space if you need the space. Whereas if we're challenging really what this architecture can be, it doesn't respond to your needs, it should respond to your wants. It doesn't respond to your requirements. It should respond to your desires, or actually make desires within you. I think this is I'm riffing on Evan here, and it shouldn't learn from you. It should teach you. Like at a certain point, that's when this notion of a what's the overall self-regulated architecture. It's when it becomes not self-regulated, when it starts regulating the user. That's when it becomes interesting, because even contemporary houses can do that in considerations. I think that's really where the project could end up. This is why it's so interesting. It's a really interesting project. So anyway, I'm riffing a little bit on Evan. I think it's how this dialogue becomes something rather than responsive. It becomes. I have a whole bunch of questions around experience, materiality, and all that kind of stuff, and whether this is just a kind of representational project. You talk about the viewer, but fundamentally that seems to be the potential of the project. And I think it goes back to your incubation and inhabitation phase. When the thing is incubating, how is it responding to the person who's going to be living in it, or the family, or the dog, or whatever? It doesn't wait for the inhabitation phase to actually then respond. I would actually suggest that those two phases could converge pretty easily and then be more interesting. That was just a big word salad. I apologize, but it's pretty interesting.
These points that have come up, I think, are really important, because this is where I found some maybe contradictory tension in the work, where you talk about removing this relationship between subject and object, but then you talk about how the object mutates and grows and transforms to serve, or it's based on the behavior of the human subject. So to me, those are kind of, you know, it's still doing the same thing of responding to human behavior and needs, but in a new way. So I think this conversation that's come up about what is this reciprocal relationship, like what is the will of the house, as opposed to the house transforming to serve the will of the occupant. So that I think needs a little bit of you know, kind of parsing out.
And after reviewing what I said, I realized that some of these ideas would come across, but I don't know if this will explain a little like what I have in my head when I'm talking about the self-regulated house. But what I'm thinking is kind of like, imagine, and I talked during my presentation about you know, finding a territory that is unknown, right? And then imposing your presence over it, right? So imagine there's a forest, right? And you walk through the thick forest, the first time is going to be complicated, right? I mean, you have to cut maybe something just to be able to go from point A to point B, right? But as you walk there every day, there's a relationship happening between you and the forest, right? So in the same way, I see the house and the human interacting, right? So we impose something just by being there, but it doesn't really mean that whatever is there, it's solely for you. So, I mean, that's the kind of like the critique I'm trying to convey through the house itself.
But doesn't that occur in, say, a hyper minimalist house where it's all about materiality and you understand the concrete wall more fully after 10 uses or 100 uses or 1,000 times you walk across it? It's responding only from a perception. Anyway, that's a.
And I do.
I liked your answer. I liked your answer, first of all, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It's actually fascinating to be playing.
I do agree that that this is something we experience in a traditional house. However, you know, the way we think about it, or we visualize it, tends to go towards the classical episteme, in which, you know, we have the roof and we have the walls, and they all are there for a purpose, and that purpose is human-centric, right? But at the moment that the roof collapses or something happens, at that moment we realize that there's more than just that.
Andres, another area that I'm curious to hear more about is the particular expression, and the question that comes up for me is, you know, you have a series of principles that you're working with, you know, which lead to this idea of estrangement and defamiliarization, and one of them is through the expression, which you've called uncanny, right?
Yeah.
So uncanny can take many forms. But in your case, it takes a very particular form. And I'm wondering by what criteria those forms emerge. Like why the particular expression that we're seeing in your project? Where's that coming from?
So I implemented the idea of uncanny in my projects because, I mean, originally uncanny is seen as anxiousness and fear, right? Out of something that is familiar, but is not entirely familiar to us, right? It becomes defamiliarized. At that moment, there's something unknown in something we know. And at least in my projects, that was translated in terms of complexity of form and the use of materiality that blurs the perception of the object, right? So I used reflective materials, translucent materials. I used some UV light and things that make that perception of the object something that is kind of like defamiliarized, right? So in that sense, the way I implemented Uncanny was through complexity and a little bit of manipulation of the material reality through, you know, things that are real, but they make it, they create some kind of like clash between, like, you know, what we know, which is like a mirror or something reflective or just a rock, but then, or a building, right? But in this case, it becomes a little more complex to the point that it creates allure and confrontation in our head. I mean, we allure in the sense that we want to approach it and look at it and understand it, but at the same time, we're kind of careful from, you know, getting too close because we don't know what it is, right? So all these forms and complexity, as we go around it, and we eventually understand it, or may try kind of understand at least part of it, right? It becomes more complex as we turn the next corner, right?
I like this project very much, but I'm increasingly frustrated by because I have a big note that says, okay, so how do you evaluate? I think it goes to Marco's question. How do you evaluate then? You're setting up these parameters and then you're saying we're doing this, and how do you evaluate them? And then you tell us that your evaluation of this is really the uncanny. There's a kind of measurement of your ability to define the uncanny, which is something that inherently, my understanding of the uncanny, is something that you can't measure. It's like something that really is responsive. It's individually responsive in a way. It's something that my understanding of the world through whatever my preoccupations have been create a kind of different uncanny sense. And to actually say, you know, it is that point where we're asking architecture to do something more than it actually should be able to do. So you can say, I'm really questioning the normative understanding of composition. Really, that's pretty straightforward. So I'm saying, where do I actually get to the point where these forms really redefine this notion about composition, about the normative aspects in which we evaluate what we make, how we look at it, like this little, I don't know, you guys, this little model here, how do we look at it and define what it is? And I know that I've got criteria, which is why it's here. I really like it. But the, you know, so I'm a little bit frustrated by this notion. I think you're just a little bit too loose sometimes with the words. You go from subject to viewer, you go from uncanny to something that's really about utility. But I'm okay with that because I think obviously this is a big field. In a way, you know, there's a point in this where it's like some sort of improvisational jazz riff on parametric techniques, and that's fascinating to watch, right? That's like you know, it's like watching a paint can explode almost. It's like you don't know where everything's going to land, but in the end there's something interesting there. Yeah, the looseness of this thing, the fact that you're pretty tightly bound, you got a jacket on and you're talking about this thing, and then there's this kind of aesthetic, and that's the word you've used more than anything. The agenda is aesthetic, the experience is aesthetic. There's this aesthetic explosion that you're asking us to redefine or to evaluate within the parameters of the single family house. I think it's just it's pretty interesting actually. So
yeah, I mean, part of the family house, the idea of the family house is the fact that it's meant to be familiar, right? It's meant to inspire comfort, which is that I think it expresses that clash that you're talking about. And it was just a perfect field of experimentation for it.
I think it's a perfect, I mean, you know, I do huge buildings, but I've always got one or two houses on the go just because it is that place in which you can look at whatever the experiments are you want to experiment somehow, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm also, it makes me start, that's all right. So it makes me start to think about, there is a film that I love, of course, which is, it's the strategy of the snail, you know, and it's literally, it's the, where your house becomes you know, and when something goes wrong, you just kind of move along, you know, or if your environment shifts, you can actually physically, it constrains you, but it also frees you, you know, at the same time. So there's huge contradictions in it, and which is also the point where there's massive possibilities, you know, in it. So like Andrew, I question the aesthetic because, you know, I just don't know where it ends, you know, and it also goes back to my preoccupation with the idea of, you know, who's in charge, right? Whose will is really making this thing be what it is at any given moment, because it sure has like its potential beyond belief. It's exponential potential. So then you get lost, but you get kind of wonderfully lost, you know. You're thinking, all right, I'm on for the ride. Here we go. Where the hell are we going? Who knows? Who cares? No, we're on the ride. Pardon me. I don't mean to go too far away from that, but it is a fascinating project, Andres.
But it is true, Evan, you're on for the ride, but then you realize the ride is responding to your needs and your utility.
I know.
And that ride really should respond to, you know, all of a sudden I've had a crisis of identity, or all of a sudden I've got Alzheimer's, or all of a sudden I've, you know, I'm, you know, I'm,
good God, yeah, no kidding.
You know, all of a sudden I don't like Fellini, like that crisis, you know, something like.
Yeah, it's existential.
Yeah, I think the existential phase is next. That's probably the post-grad work.
I think one of the dilemmas is, you know, there's the Andres could have taken the kind of Diller Scofidio approach and started from the normative supposedly at least understood, and then moved away. And then we would be asking, have you moved away far enough, or how have you moved away, or where have you gotten to? Versus this other thing that seems to be, let's just sort of throw the rock into the middle of the pond, and in some ways resist any normative things we can hang on to. And I think you might have said something to that effect. But then what you've done is locate that within the complete suburban normalcy, again supposed, and so I'm not defending Andres here. I think it's a question of are these ideas that you've put out today maybe more or less accessible to us, or the points able to be critiqued to greater or less
Arthur, you've muted yourself somehow.
I muted myself because that's my cat wailing in the background. I'm trying to shut him up.
So somehow I also muted my swearing, so apologies.
Good thing.
Yeah, blather, blather, blather. What was that word? Salad. I'm going to be using that one. Right. It's we're in again. I'm not defending him, but it's. I think it's the critique it has to and has been entered into based upon what you've presented to us, right? And that both the inability to kind of give us cues to hang on to define the things, or the intended undefinability of the object, also resists our ability to, I think, engage with it in the critique, the thesis critique.
Yeah, but we can engage with the process, and I think that that's where I'm a bit hung up here, because it's one thing to talk about this house having its own agency and it's not completely dominated by the will of the architect, et cetera, et cetera. But to be honest, Andres, it's entirely dominated by your will. You're the author. You've created this thing. It is a hypothetical exercise in a house having agency. You are still the agent here. And so you have to take responsibility for all the decisions that have been made along the way. And so this comes back to my question about the particular aesthetic. It's not arbitrary, and it hasn't just jumped out fully formed from the artificial brain of the building, right? You are the architect. And so I think the question of criteria is still a valid one. What are the forces at work that lead to your decisions about what you put before us? And it's one thing to speculate about the project having its own will, in a sense, but the fact remains that ultimately this is your story. You're the author. And so ultimately it all comes back to you. One of the things that comes to mind, the way you described the house when I was asking you about certain criteria and decisions, you talked about taking the familiar, defamiliarizing it, working with the uncanny. When you describe all that, the first project that came to mind for me was Frank Gehry's own house in Santa Monica, which by your standards is extraordinarily conventional. Mm-hmm. But by the standards of a suburban house in Santa Monica is doing all those things that you say that your extremely challenging building is doing. So by simply taking actually the familiar elements of construction, the dumbest stuff, plywood and chain link, by composing it in a particular way, by expressing it in a particular way, by elevating that junk to architecture, he's done all those things that you're claiming the uncanny does. Now, he's not obviously claiming for the agency of the house, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of displacing it, in terms of estranging it, in terms of defamiliarizing it, those elements are all there. So my point in all this isn't to say he did it, you shouldn't bother with it anymore. Not at all. What I'm saying is that it doesn't necessarily, what you're trying to get at doesn't necessarily result in what you have shown us today. So I'm curious about what the criteria are by which you made those aesthetic decisions.
Yeah, fair question.
If you put it that way, I think that there's I spoke about parametricism before, right? And I think even though it's something that is being created by us, right? There are certain rules that apply to it that sometimes just defy even our agency to a point, right? Because we are able to allow, we essentially kind of let the objects, our technologies, create things for us and record our heads on them, right? Like when we talk about anything, like just a notebook, for instance, right? So, it's no different with parametricism or with any other technology we have, in which we basically give agency to even that, right? The good thing about parametricism is that we can let the computer We give some information. It's a conversation similar to the house in which you have a conversation with the computer, comes back and forth, right? The computer will react to whatever you do through feedback, right? And then eventually you have options, right? And as you said, like there is a point in which you kind of have to like have your agency imposed somehow, but it doesn't mean that the agency of the computer is any different than the house. It bounces back to you, right? And at that moment, you create that relationship. And the expression happens as you collect all those pieces of information from the outside world and you put them together, or they put together and you just basically kind of like expose it to the world. So, I mean, this analogies could go on and on in the discourse of I would say not only the uncanny, but like post-humanism, I would say, to a point, which essentially we're getting away from the ideas of humanism and the human as the central aspect or the central role in the world. And I mean, it can be seen everywhere. Like, I mean, when we have a virus, then, it just destroys everything. Like, all our systems kind of go crazy. We have to reaccommodate ourselves because of the agency of these things that are happening around us. So, I mean, I see the house in a similar way. I don't see the house as something that is entirely my agency, right? Even though I am imposing some kind of agency, because I'm also, I mean, and this is a word that I used in my document, and I mentioned quasi-objects, right? So I mean, the house would be a quasi-object. I'm a quasi-subject, right? And there's this hybridity happening between the two things constantly.
You didn't. That was really nice, but you didn't answer Marco's question. But which I think because I have the same. I think the agenda is aesthetic, and I think at the end of the day, you're pulling the pin at certain moments. Coop Himmelblau were doing all their drawings with their eyes closed, but at the end of the day, they pick the best drawing. Once they open their eyes, they pick the best drawing, and then make the project out of that. So I think I don't think there's any argument that we're just using different tools, and this is just a really interesting sort of catalog of new tools. I actually think this self-regulating house, the title within it demands that question. You're actually demanding that it was really interesting for me. It's like, okay, we're challenging the paradigm of how we make our projects, but in the end, we're not really. What's regulated, you're regulating it yourself, even in the way you described it in its most basic form, it responds to the user. The subject becomes the viewer, then becomes the user. That's an interesting series of transferences in this thesis. But then when you do become the user, the house responds to your use. If you spend way too much time in one particular corner, that corner is going to deform. In the same way, in the normative sense, that corner with a concrete wall is just going to gather your oils and change its tone and change its materiality, or if it's wood, it's going to do something. In your case, the architecture is going to deform, which I think is pretty interesting way to define a house. It's, anyway. I just wanted to point out you didn't answer Marco's question.
No, that was good, and this is something that I may have discussed before with my supervisor and possibly with Vince at some point. And it basically it's the fact that I'm trying to find the thin line in which subject and object both have mutual agency, right? Because one of the things that could easily happen is either the subject takes over or the object takes over, right? So how do you find that thin line? And you show it in a certain way that you're showing the agency of both interacting. So I mean, that's one of the things that I've been trying to achieve, because I mean, you have a triple O, right? And then it's basically that the object entirely has its own reality, its own domain, right, outside of the subject. So I'm not trying to get to that point necessarily. I'm trying to stay within the subject object relationship. So yeah, I mean, part of the reason I'm mentioning the agency of the subject as well in the project of the house has to do with the idea of keeping the human part as well.
Okay, gentlemen, great comments, great dialogue. Thank you very much, Andreas, for your presentation. We've gone way over the time. Is there anybody who wants to wrap up? You know, I'm surprised Eisenman didn't come up in this discussion, but that's just where I'm coming from, because at my age, to be honest with you, the only thing that really matters is the proximity of the washroom to the bed at night. So congratulations on your presentation.
Maybe the house can mutate to bring it closer for you.
I don't know. Wouldn't that be something?
That'd be great as you get older. That'd be great.
Much older.
There's a few other things that could happen too, but
exactly. It all depends. Anyways, thank you very much for everyone's comments and involvement. Andreas, thank you very much. I guess you leave the scene and the rest of us stay on. Is that not how it works?
That's right. Yeah.
In this
then,
Zoom world of ours, so Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Andres.
Congratulations,
Thanks, Andres.
man.
thank you. Nice work.
Thank you.
Nice work.
Yeah, nice stash.
Well, I don't agree with, again,